I was standing in my driveway in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, watching the sunset paint the McDowell Mountains orange when Margaret Henderson marched across the street with a folder clutched to her chest like it contained nuclear launch codes. I had lived in this Scottsdale neighborhood for 3 years, and in that time, I'd learned that Margaret approaching with documentation was never a good sign. "Ethan Newman," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to talk about your flagrant violations." I set down the garden hose I'd been using to wash my truck and turned to face her. Margaret was the president of our homeowners association, a position she treated with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice. She was 52 years old with a blonde bob that hadn't changed style since 1995 and wore pearl earrings even when walking her Pomeranian at 6 in the morning. "What violations?" I asked, genuinely confused. "I kept my lawn pristine, my house painted the approved shade of desert tan, and I'd even replaced my mailbox last month to match the HOA's updated standards." She flipped open the folder with theatrical precision. "Your solar panels are not the approved brand. Your front door wreath exceeds the maximum diameter by 2 inches, and your garbage cans were visible from the street for 17 minutes, past the allowed time, last Thursday." I stared at her. "Margaret, the solar panels were approved by the Architectural Committee. I have the signed form. The wreath is seasonal decoration, which is explicitly allowed, and I was 17 minutes late bringing in my garbage cans because I was helping Mrs. Chen next door with her groceries. The approval was for a different model. You switched brands without resubmitting." She pulled out a sheet of paper covered in her handwriting. "And seasonal decorations cannot exceed 18 inches in diameter. Yours is 20 inches. I measured it myself. It's 18 inches. I measured it this morning. 20 inches. The absurdity of this conversation wasn't lost on me. I'd moved to this neighborhood because it was safe, clean, and close to my work as a civil engineer. I'd known there was an HOA, but the rules had seemed reasonable on paper. That was before Margaret had been elected president 18 months ago and transformed the association into her personal fiefdom. "Look, Margaret, I don't want any trouble. If there's an issue with the solar panels, I'll call the company and figure out what happened. But I'm not taking down my wreath because you added 2 inches with your measuring tape." Her face flushed red. "Are you accusing me of lying? I'm saying maybe we measured differently. This is exactly the attitude that's destroying property values in this neighborhood," she snapped. "You think the rules don't apply to you. Well, they do. And if you don't come into compliance immediately, the HOA will take action." "What kind of action?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "Whatever is necessary to protect this community." She closed the folder. "You have 72 hours to address these violations, or we'll proceed with fines, $50 per day per violation." She turned on her heel and marched back across the street to her house, which was, of course, perfect in every visible way. I stood there for a moment, feeling my blood pressure rise, then went inside to find the approval documents for my solar panels. My wife, Claire, would have known how to handle this better. She'd always been good with difficult people, diplomatic and calm. But Claire had died 2 years ago from cancer, and I was still learning how to navigate the world without her. She would have laughed at Margaret's measuring tape theatrics and somehow turned the whole situation into a neighborly conversation. I just got angry. I found the solar panel approval in my filing cabinet. The model number matched exactly what was on my roof. I took photos of the documentation and sent them to the HOA email address, then measured my wreath 3 times with 2 different measuring tapes, 18 inches every time. The next morning, I woke up to find a certified letter taped to my front door. I hadn't even heard the doorbell. The letter was from the HOA, detailing my violations and informing me that I was now subject to daily fines starting in 72 hours. There was also a new violation listed. My outdoor light fixtures were excessively bright and creating light pollution. I'd installed those fixtures 2 years ago, and they were motion-activated LED lights that matched every other house on the block. I walked down the street and counted. 8 houses had identical fixtures, but apparently only mine were a problem. I called the HOA's management company, Pinnacle Property Management, and got connected to a bored-sounding woman named Jessica. "Nah, I'm calling about violation notices I received," I said. "I have documentation that contradicts everything in the letter." You'll need to submit that to the Architectural Review Committee, Jessica said. They meet once a month. When's the next meeting? 3 weeks from now. But the fines start in 3 days. Then you should come into compliance. I am in compliance. That's the whole point. Jessica sighed like I was the 15th difficult homeowner she'd dealt with that morning. Look, Mr. Newman, I just processed the paperwork. If you have a dispute, you need to either attend the next committee meeting or request a hearing with the board. How do I request a hearing? Submit a written request to the board president. Margaret Henderson. Yes. I thanked her and hung up, then spent an hour drafting a formal letter to Margaret requesting a hearing. I included copies of all my documentation, photographs with measurements, and a polite but firm statement that I was in full compliance with all HOA regulations. I delivered it to her mailbox that afternoon. 2 days later, I received her response. The hearing was denied. The reason given was insufficient grounds for appeal. The fines would begin the next day. That's when I hired an attorney. I found David Park through a friend who dealt with HOA issues in Tempe. David specialized in property law and had a reputation for being thorough and aggressive when necessary. His office was in downtown Scottsdale in one of those modern glass buildings that reflected the desert sky. HOA disputes are more common than you'd think, David said during our first meeting. He was in his late 30s, dressed in a crisp suit, with an office that smelled like leather and expensive coffee. And they can get ugly fast. Walk me through everything. I laid out the timeline, showed him the documentation, and explained Margaret's escalating behavior. He took notes on a yellow legal pad and nodded occasionally. The violations are clearly without merit, he said. You have approval for the solar panels, your wreath is within regulations, and the light fixtures are standard. The problem is that HOAs have broad authority to enforce their rules, even when those rules are being interpreted unreasonably. So what can I do? First, we send a formal letter on my letterhead explaining that you're in compliance and that any fines are invalid. That sometimes makes them back down because they realize you're serious. If that doesn't work, we can file for arbitration or take them to court. How much will that cost? My retainer is $5,000. If this goes to court, you're looking at potentially $20,000 to $30,000, depending on how long it drags out. I felt sick. Over a wreath and some solar panels? Over the principle of the thing, David corrected. This isn't really about violations. This is about control. Your HOA president has decided she doesn't like you, and she's using her position to make your life difficult. The question is whether you want to fight it or just pay the fines and try to stay under her radar. I thought about Claire. She would have told me to pick my battles, to not let stress consume me over something petty. But she also would have been furious at the injustice of it. Send the letter, I said. David drafted a comprehensive legal letter that outlined every way the HOA's violation notices were incorrect, cited specific sections of Arizona HOA law, and politely but firmly stated that any fines levied would be challenged in court. He sent it certified mail to both Margaret and the management company. For 3 days, nothing happened. I thought maybe it had worked. Then I came home from work to find Margaret standing on my front porch with 2 other people. A man in his 60s wearing a polo shirt with the management company logo, and a woman about Margaret's age carrying a clipboard. Ethan Newman, Margaret said. This is Robert from Pinnacle Property Management and Susan Torres, our HOA vice president. We're conducting an inspection. An inspection of what? Your property. We have the right to inspect any property in the association to ensure compliance with our covenants. I pulled out my phone and texted David. You can't just show up and inspect my property without notice. Actually, we can, Robert said, his voice apologetic but firm. It's in the CC and RS you signed when you purchased the home. The HOA has the right to inspect external features of any property with reasonable cause. What's the reasonable cause? Margaret held up a folder. Your attorney's threatening letter. We need to verify your claims about being in compliance. David texted back. Don't let them inside. They can observe from the street or common areas only. Record everything. I started a video recording on my phone. You can see everything from the street or the driveway. You're not going into my backyard or my house. We need to see the solar panel installation and wiring, Margaret said. The panels are visible from the street. The wiring is internal and none of your business." Susan spoke up for the first time. "Mr. Newman, we're not trying to be difficult. We just want to resolve this situation." "Then drop the invalid violations." Margaret's expression hardened. "The violations stand. If you continue to refuse cooperation, we'll have no choice but to escalate this matter." "Escalate to what?" "Whatever legal remedies are available to us." They walked around my front yard, taking photographs and making notes. Robert measured my wreath, and even he admitted it was 18 inches. Margaret insisted he was measuring wrong and did it herself, somehow finding a way to stretch it to 19.5 inches. I recorded all of this. When they left, I sent the video to David. "This is harassment," he said when he called me that evening. "Document everything, every interaction, every letter, every phone call. We're building a case. A case for what? If we end up in court, we want to show a pattern of targeting and unreasonable behavior. It'll help with your defense and potentially support a countersuit for harassment and legal fees." Over the next 2 weeks, the situation spiraled. Margaret sent violation notices for increasingly absurd things. My grass was allegedly half an inch too long in one section. My house numbers were faded and needed repainting. My driveway had excessive weathering, and my mailbox post was slightly off-center. I documented everything. I took photos with rulers and measuring tapes. I had my lawn professionally measured and got a written statement from the landscaping company that it was within regulation height. I had a surveyor confirm my mailbox was perfectly centered on my property line. The fines accumulated. According to Margaret's math, I now owed the HOA over $3,000. Then things got weird. I came home one afternoon to find Margaret and Susan standing at the edge of my property with a man in an expensive suit. They were having an intense conversation, pointing at my house and the surrounding properties. I walked over. "Can I help you?" The man extended his hand. "Richard Matthews, Real Estate Development. I'm consulting with the HOA on a potential project." "What kind of project?" Margaret jumped in before Richard could answer. "That's HOA business, not individual homeowner business." "If it involves my property, it's my business." "It doesn't involve your specific property," Susan said, but her eyes shifted nervously. "Then why are you standing in my yard?" Richard smiled in that way expensive consultants do when they're trying to smooth over tension. "We're just doing preliminary surveys of the neighborhood. Nothing to worry about." They left, but something about the interaction bothered me. I called David and described what had happened. "I'll do some digging," he said. "Development consultants don't just show up randomly." 2 days later, David called me with news. I found out what they're up to. The HOA is exploring the possibility of selling the common areas and potentially some properties to a development company. They want to build a mixed-use commercial and residential complex. "They can't sell my house?" "No, but they're probably trying to make life difficult enough that you'll sell voluntarily. If they can get enough homeowners to sell, they can push through the development deal. The HOA board would get significant kickbacks from the developer." "That's insane. That's profitable. I've seen it before. Not common, but it happens." "So what do I do?" "First, we need to inform the other homeowners. Most of them probably have no idea this is being discussed. Second, you need to start attending HOA meetings. They're required to be open to all members." The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7 p.m. in the community center. I showed up at 6:55. The community center was a small building near the neighborhood entrance with a meeting room that could hold maybe 50 people. When I walked in, Margaret was sitting at a table at the front of the room with Susan and 2 other board members I'd never met. There were 5 other homeowners scattered in the chairs. Margaret's eyes narrowed when she saw me. "Mr. Newman, how nice of you to join us. I'm a member of this association. I have every right to be here." "Of course." She smiled tightly. The meeting started with standard business, approval of last month's minutes, financial reports, maintenance updates. It was boring and bureaucratic. Then they got to new business. "We've been approached by a development company interested in enhancing our neighborhood," Margaret said. "They've proposed a plan that would include updating our common areas, improving property values, and bringing in new amenities." One of the other homeowners, a woman in her 70s named Dorothy, raised her hand. "What kind of development?" "It's preliminary," Susan said quickly. "Nothing concrete yet." But what are they proposing? Dorothy pressed. Margaret shuffled papers. Mixed-use development, some retail, some residential. It would replace the current park and green space with something more modern and functional. I like the park, said another homeowner, a middle-aged man named Tom. My kids play there. The new plan would include recreational facilities, Margaret said. I raised my hand. Margaret ignored me. I raised it higher. Yes, Mr. Newman, she said, her voice dripping with forced patience. Has the board voted on this development proposal? We're in exploratory phases only. That's not what I asked. Has there been a vote? We don't need to vote on exploration. Actually, according to Arizona revised statutes, Title 33, Chapter 9, any major decision affecting common property requires a vote of the homeowners association members, not just the board. Margaret's face flushed. Thank you for the legal lecture, Mr. Newman, but I think I know how to run this association. I'm just pointing out that if you're considering selling common property, the membership needs to be informed and vote on it. We're not selling anything. We're exploring options to improve the neighborhood. Does the development company's proposal include acquiring any private properties? The room went silent. The other homeowners leaned forward. Margaret set down her papers. I don't appreciate your hostile tone. I'm not being hostile. I'm asking a direct question. Does the proposal include acquiring private properties? And if so, how would that acquisition occur? Susan jumped in. Some developments might include voluntary buyouts of interested homeowners. And what if homeowners aren't interested in selling? Margaret stood up. Mr. Newman, you're disrupting this meeting with paranoid accusations. If you can't behave civilly, I'll have to ask you to leave. I'm asking reasonable questions about a major development that affects all of us. This isn't the appropriate forum. This is literally the exact appropriate forum. This is an HOA meeting where association business is discussed. Dorothy raised her hand again. I'd like to hear more about this development. Margaret, do you have detailed plans you can share? Not at this time. Then why bring it up? Tom asked. The meeting devolved into argument. Several homeowners demanded more information. Margaret kept insisting everything was preliminary and refused to share details. Finally, she adjourned the meeting early, claiming there was no other business to discuss. As people filed out, Dorothy approached me. Thank you for speaking up. I had no idea any of this was happening. Neither did most people, I think. Margaret's been acting strange for months, secretive. I thought she was just being her usual controlling self, but this is different. Tom joined us. You really think they're trying to push people out? I think the HOA president has a financial interest in a development deal, and she's making life difficult for homeowners who might resist it. That's illegal, isn't it? It's definitely unethical. Whether it's illegal depends on exactly what she's doing. Over the next week, I talked to as many neighbors as I could. Most were shocked to hear about the development proposal. Several mentioned receiving nitpicky violation notices from Margaret recently. A pattern was emerging. Margaret was targeting homeowners who owned their properties outright or had lived there for many years, people who would be less likely to move easily. David filed a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOA management companies. He also drafted a petition demanding that the HOA board disclose all communications with development companies and hold a special meeting to vote on whether to continue negotiations. I needed 30% of homeowners to sign the petition to force the special meeting. There were 147 homes in the association. I needed 45 signatures. I spent 2 weeks walking door to door. Some people signed immediately, others were hesitant, afraid of retaliation from Margaret. A few told me I was making a big deal out of nothing and closed their doors in my face. By the end of the 2 weeks, I had 52 signatures. I delivered the petition to Margaret personally. She was in her front yard trimming roses. "What's this?" she asked, not looking up from her pruning. A petition signed by 52 homeowners demanding disclosure of all development negotiations and a special meeting to vote on whether the board should continue pursuing this. She set down her shears and took the papers. Her expression shifted from annoyance to something harder to read. Maybe respect, maybe anger. "You've been busy," she said. "I've been protecting my home." "Your home," she laughed without humor. "You think this is about your home. This is about the entire neighborhood, about progress and improvement. This is about you making money off a development deal. Her eyes flashed. Be very careful what you accuse me of, Mr. Newman. I'm not accusing, I'm stating facts. You've been in contact with Richard Matthews Development for 6 months. You've received consulting fees totaling $15,000. And you've been systematically harassing homeowners who you think will oppose the development. I have no idea what you're talking about. I have bank records. My attorney subpoenaed them as part of our legal filings. That was a bluff. David had requested records but hadn't received them yet. But Margaret didn't know that. She stepped closer. You want to play hardball? Fine. You think you're in compliance with association rules? I will find every single violation in your property and I will bury you in fines. And if you don't pay them, the HOA has the legal right to place a lien on your property. And if that lien isn't satisfied, we can foreclose. You'll lose your house. That's not how it works. That's exactly how it works. You signed the CC and RS. You agreed to be bound by HOA rules and to pay all fines and assessments. Failure to pay gives us the right to collect, including through foreclosure. You're talking about foreclosing on my house because my wreath is allegedly 2 inches too big. I'm talking about protecting property values and community standards. You're talking about intimidation and fraud. She picked up her shears. Get off my property. I left, but my hands were shaking. I called David immediately. She threatened foreclosure, I told him. Can she actually do that? Technically, yes. If you have unpaid fines and assessments, the HOA can place a lien on your property. If the lien remains unpaid, they can foreclose. But it's a long process with lots of legal steps, and in your case, since the fines are invalid, any attempt to foreclose would be thrown out by a court. But she could try. She could try. It would cost the HOA a lot of money in legal fees, and they'd lose. But she could initiate the process to intimidate you. So what do? You keep fighting. You've got the petition. The special meeting has to happen. In the meantime, don't pay the fines. We're going to challenge every single one of them. The special meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Margaret tried to schedule it at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, knowing most people work, but David pointed out that Arizona law requires HOA meetings to be scheduled at times reasonable for member attendance. The meeting got moved to 7 p.m. on a Wednesday. In the days leading up to the meeting, Margaret escalated her campaign. She sent notice to every homeowner in the association, warning about organized efforts to undermine community leadership and claiming I was spreading false and defamatory information about the board. She also sent me a letter claiming that, due to unpaid fines, the HOA was initiating lien proceedings against my property. David filed for an emergency injunction to stop the lien. We got a court date for 2 days before the special meeting. The courtroom was small and overheated. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Brennan, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Margaret showed up with an attorney, a nervous-looking young guy named Brad Thornton who kept adjusting his tie. Judge Brennan reviewed the case materials. So the HOA has levied fines against Mr. Newman for various violations, and he's claiming those violations are invalid. That's correct, Your Honor, David said. We have extensive documentation showing that Mr. Newman is in full compliance with all association regulations. The violations are pretextual and part of a pattern of harassment related to his opposition to a development deal the HOA president is personally profiting from. Brad stood up. Your Honor, the HOA has broad discretion in enforcing its covenants. Mr. Newman signed those covenants when he purchased his property. The association has followed proper procedures in assessing fines. Have the violations been verified? The judge asked. Yes, Your Honor. The board conducted an inspection. An inspection that contradicted the measurements taken by a licensed surveyor and professional landscaping company, David countered. We have documentation showing that the HOA president personally altered measurements to create violations. Judge Brennan looked at Margaret. Did you alter measurements? Margaret stood. Absolutely not, Your Honor. I conducted a thorough and honest inspection. Do you have photographs or other documentation? Yes. Brad handed over a folder. David had his own folder. Your Honor, we have video evidence of the inspection showing the HOA president manipulating measuring tools to inflate dimensions. The judge spent 10 minutes reviewing both sets of evidence. Finally, she set down the papers. I'm issuing a temporary injunction against the lien. The HOA may not proceed with collection efforts until the underlying violations are properly adjudicated. I'm also ordering both parties to participate in mediation within 30 days. She looked at Margaret. And I'm strongly advising the HOA to reconsider these fines. From what I can see, this looks like harassment. We walked out of the courthouse. Margaret and Brad headed to their car without looking at me. David was pleased. That went well, he said. The judge basically told them they're on shaky ground. But she didn't dismiss the fines entirely. She can't, not without a full hearing. But the injunction protects you from the lien, and her comments will be in the record. That'll help if this goes further. 2 days later, the special meeting happened. The community center was packed. Nearly 90 homeowners showed up, along with the board members, David, Margaret's attorney Brad, and Richard Matthews from the development company. Margaret called the meeting to order. She looked tired. This meeting has been called in response to a petition regarding the association's consideration of a development proposal, she said. Before we begin, I want to clarify some misunderstandings that have been spread through the community. This isn't a clarification session, Dorothy called out. This is a disclosure and vote session. We want to see the development proposal and all related communications. Yeah, several other homeowners echoed. Margaret glanced at Brad, who nodded slightly. She pulled out a thick folder. The development company has proposed a comprehensive neighborhood enhancement plan. This would involve redeveloping the current park and common areas into a mixed-use space with retail, dining, and updated recreational facilities. The project would significantly increase property values. How much would it increase our HOA dues? Tom asked. The developer would be responsible for maintaining the new facilities. That's not what I asked. Richard Matthews stood up. If I may address the group, I'm Richard Matthews, and my company has successfully completed similar projects in neighborhoods throughout Arizona. Our proposal would transform this community into a modern, high-value development. Yes, there would be changes, but the benefits far outweigh any temporary inconvenience. What about the properties adjacent to the common areas? I asked. Your proposal includes acquiring some private homes, doesn't it? Richard smiled. Some homeowners might choose to sell as part of the development. We'd offer fair market value plus a premium. And if homeowners don't want to sell? We'd work around those properties. That's not true, I said. I pulled out documents David had obtained through public records requests. Your company filed preliminary plans with Scottsdale's planning department. Those plans show 12 private properties incorporated into the development footprint. You need those properties for the project to work. The room erupted in noise. Homeowners shouted questions. Richard tried to respond but couldn't be heard over the chaos. Margaret banged a gavel. Order! We need order! Tell us the truth, someone shouted. Are you trying to take our homes? Margaret's face was crimson. No one is taking anyone's homes. This is a voluntary program. Then why are you harassing homeowners with fake violations? Dorothy demanded. Why are you trying to force people to sell? I'm not forcing anyone to do anything. I'm enforcing association rules. You're enforcing made-up rules to push your development deal, I said, and you're personally profiting from it. You've received $15,000 in consulting fees from Richard's company. The room went silent. Everyone stared at Margaret. That's a lie, she said. David stood up. It's documented in bank records we subpoenaed. Margaret Henderson received 3 payments of $5,000 each from Matthews Development over the past 6 months, described as consulting fees. Brad jumped to his feet. Those payments were for legitimate consulting work. Mrs. Henderson has experience in community planning and was hired in a personal capacity, separate from her role as HOA president. She's being paid by a company that's negotiating with the HOA she controls, David countered. That's a clear conflict of interest and likely violates her fiduciary duty to the association. The meeting descended into shouting. Homeowners demanded Margaret's resignation. Margaret insisted she'd done nothing wrong. Susan, the vice president, sat silently, looking like she wanted to disappear. Finally, Dorothy stood up and projected her voice over the chaos. I move that we hold an immediate vote of no confidence in the current board and call for new elections. I second, Tom said immediately. Margaret tried to argue that the motion was out of order, but homeowners drowned her out. David quietly explained to me that special meetings could only address items specified in the petition, but the homeowners were too angry to care about procedural niceties. A vote was called. Out of the 87 homeowners present, 79 voted to remove the current board. Only Margaret, Susan, and 6 others voted against. New elections were scheduled for 2 weeks later. In the meantime, a temporary oversight committee was appointed to manage association business. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days after the meeting, I came home to find my truck's windows smashed and my tires slashed. Spray painted across my garage door in red paint were the words, "Traitor to your community." I called the police. Officer Davis arrived within 20 minutes and took a report. She photographed the damage and collected paint samples. "Any idea who might have done this?" she asked. "I have suspicions, but no proof." "Want to share those suspicions?" I explained the HOA situation. Officer Davis listened, taking notes. "HOA disputes can get nasty," she said, "but vandalism crosses a legal line. If you get any more harassment or threats, call us immediately, and you might want to install security cameras." I installed 4 cameras the next day, covering all angles of my property. I also filed a report with my insurance company about the damage. The vandalism made local news. A reporter from the Arizona Republic wrote a story about HOA corruption and harassment in Scottsdale neighborhoods. Margaret was quoted defending her actions and claiming I was running a smear campaign against her. The reporter, a woman named Amanda Chen, called me for comment. We talked for an hour. She was sharp and asked detailed questions. The resulting article was published 3 days later with the headline, "Scottsdale HOA, President Accused of Corruption, Homeowner Harassment." The article outlined the development deal, Margaret's consulting payments, the questionable fines, and the vote of no confidence. It mentioned the vandalism to my property. It included quotes from multiple homeowners about Margaret's behavior. Margaret responded with a lawsuit. She sued me, David, Dorothy, Tom, and the Arizona Republic for defamation, claiming we damaged her reputation with false statements. David was unfazed. Typical intimidation tactic. She won't win. Everything in the article is documented and true, but it'll cost time and money to defend. More legal fees. I'm afraid so, but I think we can get the case dismissed quickly and will counterclaim for malicious prosecution and abuse of process. The new board elections happened on schedule. Dorothy ran for president and won overwhelmingly. Tom became vice president. The new board's first action was to terminate all negotiations with Matthews Development and to launch an investigation into the previous board's finances. Margaret refused to turn over association records. The new board had to get a court order compelling her to comply. When the records were finally produced, they showed that Margaret had authorized nearly $40,000 in payments to Matthews Development for various consulting and planning fees, none of which had been disclosed to the membership. The new board voted to file a civil lawsuit against Margaret and the previous board members for breach of fiduciary duty and misappropriation of association funds. They also referred the matter to the Arizona Attorney General's office. Meanwhile, Margaret's defamation lawsuit ground forward. We went through discovery, depositions, and motions. David filed for summary judgment, arguing that Margaret couldn't prove any false statements. The hearing for summary judgment was in February. Different judge this time, a man named Judge Robert Hartley, who had a reputation for being no-nonsense. Margaret's attorney argued that the statements in the newspaper article implied criminal behavior and destroyed her standing in the community. David argued that truth is an absolute defense to defamation and that every statement was supported by documentation. Judge Hartley reviewed the evidence. "Ms. Henderson, you did receive payments from the development company while serving as HOA president, correct?" "Yes, but they were for consulting work, not—" "And you did not disclose these payments to the association membership?" "I didn't think I needed to. It was personal business." "You were being paid by a company that was negotiating a deal with an organization you controlled. You don't see how that's a conflict of interest?" "I was trying to help the neighborhood." "By accepting $15,000 from a developer?" "Ms. Henderson, I'm granting summary judgment for the defendants. Your lawsuit is dismissed. Furthermore, I'm awarding attorney's fees to the defendants, to be paid by you personally." Margaret's face went white. "Your Honor, my ruling stands. This lawsuit was frivolous and appears to have been filed to silence legitimate criticism. You're lucky I'm not sanctioning you further." We walked out of the courthouse into bright February sunshine. David was grinning. "That's pretty much the best result we could have hoped for," he said. "She'll have to pay our legal fees, which should be around $30,000. That might make her think twice about filing more nonsense lawsuits." "Is it over?" I asked. "The defamation case is over. The HOA's lawsuit against her is still proceeding, and the Attorney General's investigation is ongoing. But as far as your personal dispute with her?" "Yes, I think it's over." It wasn't over. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from Margaret's new attorney, a different lawyer named Patricia Wu. The letter was bizarre. It claimed that due to my continued violations and harassment of the HOA board, Margaret, acting in her capacity as concerned citizen and property owner, was initiating eminent domain proceedings to acquire my property. I read the letter 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding. Then I called David. "She's threatening what?" he said. "Eminent domain. She says she's initiating proceedings to take my property through eminent domain." Silence on the other end of the line. Then David started laughing. "She said that? In writing?" "Yes, her attorney sent a formal letter." "Ethan, that's not how eminent domain works, at all. Only government entities can exercise eminent domain. A private citizen can't just decide to take someone's property." "I know that. You know that. Apparently Margaret doesn't know that. Or her attorney is even dumber than I thought. Can you send me a copy of that letter?" I scanned and emailed it to him. He called back 10 minutes later, still amused. "This is incredible. I mean, it's wrong on so many legal levels that I don't even know where to start. First, she has no authority to initiate eminent domain. Second, even if a government entity wanted your property, they'd need to prove public use and pay just compensation. Third, you can't use eminent domain as retaliation in a private dispute. This is possibly the stupidest legal threat I've seen in 15 years of practice. So what do I do?" "Nothing. Let her try to follow through. She'll figure out pretty quickly that no court will entertain this. In fact, this might help our case. It shows continued harassment and complete disregard for basic legal principles." I tried to relax, but the threat bothered me. It was so absurd that it felt dangerous, like Margaret had completely disconnected from reality. 2 days later, Margaret filed paperwork with the Maricopa County Superior Court, claiming that my property was blighted, dangerous to the community, and subject to acquisition through eminent domain procedures. The filing was incoherent, citing statutes that didn't apply and making claims that were objectively false. The court clerk apparently flagged it as problematic because a judge reviewed it immediately and scheduled a hearing. That hearing was in March on a Thursday afternoon. I took off work. David and I arrived early. Margaret was there with her attorney, Patricia Wu, a woman in her 40s who looked uncomfortable. Judge Brennan was assigned to the case again. She did not look happy. "Ms. Wu," the judge said, "please explain to me the legal basis for this filing." Patricia stood up. "Your Honor, my client believes that Mr. Newman's property has become a nuisance and a danger to the community. She's seeking to have the property acquired through eminent domain so it can be remediated." "Who does your client believe has the authority to exercise eminent domain?" "Your Honor, the HOA." "Stop right there." Judge Brennan held up a hand. "Are you seriously arguing that a homeowners association can exercise eminent domain?" "In cases where property poses a danger, Your Honor, the HOA has authority to take action under Arizona law." "Cite the statute." Patricia shuffled through papers. Arizona Revised Statutes, Title 33. Chapter 16 gives HOAs authority to maintain community standards and address violations. That statute gives HOAs the right to enforce covenants and assess fines. It does not give them the power of eminent domain. Eminent domain is the right of government entities to take private property for public use with just compensation. It's a sovereign power. Private organizations, including HOAs, do not possess it. Your Honor, my client believes— I don't care what your client believes. Belief doesn't create legal authority. Ms. Wu, you're an attorney. You should know this is frivolous. Patricia looked at Margaret, then back at the judge. Your Honor, my client was insistent. I advised her this was not proper, but she insisted on filing. Margaret stood up. Your Honor, if I may. You may not. Sit down, Ms. Henderson. But he's destroying the neighborhood. He's undermining property values. And Ms. Henderson, sit down or I will hold you in contempt. Margaret sat, her face flushed and angry. Judge Brennan turned to David. Mr. Park, do you wish to respond? David stood. Your Honor, I think the frivolous nature of this filing speaks for itself. However, I'd like to note that this is part of an ongoing campaign of harassment against my client. Ms. Henderson has filed baseless violation claims, threatened foreclosure, sued for defamation, and now filed this nonsensical eminent domain action. We ask the court to not only dismiss this filing, but to issue an order prohibiting Ms. Henderson from initiating any further legal actions against Mr. Newman without court approval. Granted, Judge Brennan said immediately. This filing is dismissed. Ms. Henderson, you are hereby prohibited from filing any further legal actions, complaints, or proceedings against Ethan Newman without first obtaining permission from this court. Do you understand? This is a violation of my rights, Margaret shouted. You have the right to remain silent right now, which I strongly suggest you exercise. I am also sanctioning you personally in the amount of $5,000 payable to Mr. Newman for filing this frivolous action. Margaret looked like she might explode. Patricia put a hand on her arm, trying to calm her down. Furthermore, the judge continued, I'm referring this matter to the State Bar for review of Ms. Wu's conduct in filing a claim she admittedly knew was improper. Patricia went pale. Your Honor, my client insisted. You're an officer of the court. You have a duty not to file frivolous claims regardless of what your client demands. This hearing is adjourned. We left the courthouse. Margaret stood in the parking lot, screaming at Patricia, who was trying to explain something. I heard fragments. Told you it wouldn't work. Should have listened. David drove me back to my car. That was satisfying, he said, but be careful. She's not stable. People do unpredictable things when they're cornered. You think she'd do something dangerous? I think she's facing financial ruin, legal consequences, and complete humiliation. That makes people desperate. That night, I made sure all my security cameras were working. I double-checked my locks. I felt ridiculous being afraid of a 52-year-old HOA president, but David's warning had spooked me. Nothing happened that night, or the next day. Life started to return to normal. The new HOA board dropped all the violations against me. My attorney's fees were being paid by Margaret through the court judgments. The development deal was dead. Then, a month later, the Arizona Attorney General's office filed criminal charges. Margaret Henderson was charged with theft, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The investigation had uncovered that she'd authorized payments to fake vendors that were actually shell companies she controlled. Over 2 years, she'd stolen nearly $120,000 from the HOA. The Matthews Development consulting fees were just the tip of the iceberg. She'd created invoices for landscaping work that was never done, security services that didn't exist, and legal fees for consultations that never happened. All the money had flowed into accounts she controlled. The story made statewide news. Margaret's arrest was covered by every major outlet in Arizona. She posted bail and immediately went into hiding. The HOA sued her in civil court to recover the stolen funds. Her house went into foreclosure. She declared bankruptcy. In June, she pleaded guilty to 3 counts of theft and 1 count of fraud. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution of $120,000 to the HOA. On the day of her sentencing, I went to the courthouse. I'm not sure why. Curiosity, maybe. Closure. Margaret looked smaller in her orange jumpsuit. Her blonde bob was gone, replaced by gray roots in a messy ponytail. When the judge read the sentence, she didn't react. She just stared at the floor. As they let her out, she looked at me. Our eyes met for a second. I expected to see anger, hatred. Instead, I saw something like exhaustion. Then she was gone. Dorothy approached me outside the courthouse. "How do you feel?" she asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. Relieved, I guess, but also kind of sad. Sad? After everything she did? She destroyed her whole life over an HOA and a development deal. It just seems like such a waste, Dorothy nodded. It is, but she made her choices. You just defended your home. The HOA stabilized under Dorothy's leadership. The stolen funds were partially recovered through Margaret's bankruptcy estate and insurance claims. Dues were raised slightly to cover the shortfall, but nothing dramatic. Life in the neighborhood returned to something approaching normal. People still gossiped about the scandal, but gradually the conversations moved on to other things: kids' soccer games, the summer heat, the usual rhythms of suburban life. I kept the security cameras up. I still attended HOA meetings occasionally just to stay informed. Dorothy ran things efficiently and transparently, the way an HOA should be run. In August, I got a letter from Brad Thornton, Margaret's first attorney. He'd written to apologize for his role in the harassment. He explained that Margaret had lied to him about the facts and that he'd withdrawn as her counsel once he realized what was happening. He'd also reported her to the disciplinary board. His letter was contrite and seemed genuine. I wrote back, thanking him for the apology and wishing him well. Everyone makes mistakes. He'd at least tried to make it right. Patricia Wu, the attorney who filed the eminent domain claim, was suspended from practicing law for 6 months. She had argued to the state bar that she was following her client's instructions, but the bar ruled that attorneys have a duty not to file claims they know are frivolous. It was harsh, but probably fair. My legal fees totaled about $48,000 when everything was done. Between the court judgments against Margaret and what was recovered from the HOA's insurance, I got back about $35,000. I ate the remaining $13,000, which hurt but felt worth it. In September, almost a year after this whole thing started, I replaced my front door wreath. The new one was definitely 18 inches, measured carefully. I planted new flowers in my front yard. I repainted my mailbox post, even though it didn't need it. One evening, Tom from the neighborhood stopped by. "Hey, Ethan, we're organizing a block party for October. You interested in helping?" "Sure," I said. "What do you need?" "Just people to help set up, bring food, the usual." Dorothy thought it would be good for the neighborhood to have something positive after all the drama. "Sounds great." The block party happened on a perfect October Saturday. The weather was cooling down, dropping into the 80s instead of the brutal hundreds of summer. Kids ran around playing games. Adults chatted and ate burgers and potato salad. Someone set up a volleyball net in the park that Margaret had wanted to replace with a commercial development. I stood there watching the sun set behind the mountains, the same view I'd been enjoying the day Margaret first marched across the street with her folder of violations. It felt like a lifetime ago. Dorothy walked over, holding a paper plate with a burger. "Good turnout," she said. "Yeah, nice to see everyone actually enjoying themselves. You know, you could run for the board. We have an opening." I laughed. "I think I've had enough HOA drama for a lifetime." "Fair enough. But seriously, thank you. If you hadn't fought back, Margaret would have gotten away with all of it. The neighborhood would have been destroyed. I just didn't want to lose my house. Sometimes that's enough. Standing up for yourself, not letting bullies win." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching kids chase each other around the grass. "Claire would have handled it better," I said. "She was always better with people." "Maybe," Dorothy said, "but you did just fine. You protected your home. I think she'd be proud of that." I thought about Claire, about the life we'd built in this house, the memories we'd made, about how hard it had been after she died, learning to navigate everything alone. "Yeah," I said, "maybe she would." The party went late into the evening. String lights came on as the sky darkened. Music played from someone's portable speaker. It was exactly the kind of simple, uncomplicated neighborhood gathering that should be normal, but felt special after everything we'd been through. Around 10, people started packing up. I helped fold tables and carry chairs back to the community center. The park looked messy with paper plates and cups scattered around, but Dorothy organized a cleanup crew, and within 20 minutes it was pristine again. I walked home under streetlights, hands in my pockets, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Peace, maybe, or just the absence of constant stress. My house looked good in the darkness. The solar panels on the roof were invisible at night, but I knew they were there, saving me money on electricity and doing their small part for the environment. My 18-inch wreath hung on the door. My perfectly centered mailbox stood at the property line. Everything in compliance, everything as it should be. I unlocked the door and went inside. The house was quiet. I turned on lights, checked the security camera feeds out of habit, then made a cup of tea and sat on the couch. On the coffee table was a framed photo of Claire and me from 5 years ago, taken on a hiking trip to Sedona. We were both grinning, red rocks glowing behind us in the sunset. She looked happy and healthy, no sign yet of the cancer that would take her. "We won," I told the photo. "The crazy HOA lady went to prison. The neighborhood's safe. The house is safe." The photo didn't respond, of course, but I felt like Claire would have been pleased, not about Margaret going to prison necessarily, but about the fact that I'd stood up for myself, that I hadn't let someone bully me out of the home we'd chosen together. I finished my tea, locked up, and went to bed. The next morning was Sunday. I slept late, made breakfast, and did absolutely nothing productive. It felt amazing. On Monday, I went back to work. My boss knew about the HOA situation. It had been hard to hide with all the court dates and newspaper articles. He'd been supportive throughout, letting me adjust my schedule when needed. "Everything settled?" he asked when I stopped by his office. "Yeah, finally. Thanks for being flexible with my schedule." "No problem. Sounds like it was quite a mess." That's putting it mildly. Life moved forward. The seasons changed. Arizona winter arrived, which meant temperatures in the 60s and 70s instead of the hundreds. Tourists flooded Scottsdale, filling the restaurants and golf courses. The neighborhood stayed quiet and drama-free. In December, I got a Christmas card from Dorothy. Inside, she'd written, "Thank you for your courage this year. Our neighborhood is better because you stood up. Merry Christmas." I put the card on my mantel next to the other cards from friends and family. It sat there through the holidays, a reminder of the weird, stressful, ultimately successful year I'd had. On Christmas Eve, I drove up to Flagstaff to spend the holiday with my sister and her family. The drive took me through the beautiful Arizona landscape, desert giving way to pine forests, elevation climbing, temperature dropping. Snow appeared on the ground as I got closer to Flagstaff. My sister Emma and her husband Dan had 3 kids who were excited about Santa and presents and all the magic of Christmas. Being around them was good for me. It reminded me that life was bigger than HOA disputes and legal battles. "So you really went through all that over a wreath?" Emma asked on Christmas morning while we were making breakfast. "It started with a wreath. It ended with the HOA president going to prison for theft." "That's insane." "Yeah, it was a weird year. How are you doing? Really?" I thought about it. "Better. Some days are still hard without Claire, but I'm okay." "I'm glad you fought back. Claire would have been proud." That's what Dorothy said. Dorothy's right. I spent 3 days in Flagstaff, enjoying the cold weather and the family time. Then, I drove back to Scottsdale, back to my house, back to normal life. The new year started quietly. The HOA continued functioning smoothly. Margaret was in prison. The development company had moved on to other projects. My violations were expunged from the record. My legal battles were over. In January, I received a check for $5,000 from the court the sanction Judge Brennan had levied against Margaret for the eminent domain filing. It felt like found money, a little bonus for surviving the ordeal. I used some of it to take a vacation. Just a long weekend in San Diego, but it felt good to get away. I walked on the beach, ate good food, and didn't think about HOAs or property disputes or any of it. When I got back, there was a letter in my mailbox from the Arizona Department of Real Estate. They'd completed their investigation into Pinnacle Property Management, the company that had managed our HOA. The investigation found that the company had failed to properly oversee the HOA's finances and had ignored red flags about Margaret's behavior. The company was fined and required to implement new oversight procedures. It was a small victory, but it felt important. Maybe the next homeowner who faced an out-of-control HOA president would get help earlier because of what happened in our neighborhood. Life continued its steady rhythm: work, home, occasional social events. I started dating again, cautiously. Nothing serious, just coffee or dinner with women I met through friends or online. It felt strange after being married for so long, but also kind of exciting. The neighborhood thrived. Property values actually went up, not because of a commercial development, but because word got out that we had a functional, reasonable HOA. People wanted to live in a place where the association actually served homeowners instead of harassing them. Dorothy served 2 years as president, then stepped down. Tom took over. The board functioned the way it was supposed to, maintaining common areas, enforcing reasonable rules, staying out of people's lives except when necessary. My solar panels continued generating electricity. My wreath changed with the seasons. My garbage cans were usually brought in on time, though occasionally I was a few minutes late and nobody cared. In March, almost 2 years after the ordeal began, I got a letter from the Arizona Department of Corrections. Margaret Henderson had been released early for good behavior. She'd served 18 months of her 4-year sentence. The letter was a standard notification sent to victims. It gave her release date and explained that she was prohibited from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my property as part of her parole conditions. I wondered what she was doing now, where she was living. I hoped she'd learned something from the experience, though I suspected she probably blamed me for everything that had happened to her. Some people are like that. I never saw her again. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved to New Mexico to live with a relative. Someone said she was working as a cashier at a grocery store. The details were fuzzy and probably partly wrong, but the basic truth was clear. Her life had completely changed, and not for the better. I felt sorry for her in a way. She'd had a decent life before all this. A house, a position of authority, respect in the community. She'd thrown it all away because of greed and a need for control. It was a tragedy, even if it was self-inflicted. But mostly I just felt grateful. Grateful that I'd fought back, grateful for David's legal help, grateful for neighbors like Dorothy and Tom who'd supported me. Grateful that the system, however slowly and imperfectly, had ultimately worked. My house stood solid and comfortable in the Arizona heat. The neighborhood around it thrived with families and friends and the ordinary, wonderful rhythms of daily life. The HOA functioned quietly in the background, doing its job without drama or corruption. And I lived there peacefully, enjoying my home, remembering my wife, building whatever future was ahead of me. The crazy year of HOA battles and legal wars faded into memory, becoming a story I told occasionally at parties, a weird chapter in my life that was over now. Sometimes I'd stand in my driveway at sunset, watching the mountains turn orange and purple in the fading light, and I'd think about how close I'd come to losing all of this. How Margaret had tried to force me out, to steal my home through harassment and intimidation and absurd legal threats. But I'd held on, I'd fought back, and I'd won. That was enough. That was everything. The wreath on my front door, exactly 18 inches in diameter, turned gently in the evening breeze.